Inside a crowded courtroom, chaos erupted as a stray dog barged in, barking loudly 3 times before sitting in the center of the room. Moments later, something happened that left everyone frozen in disbelief. What could this mysterious dog be trying to reveal? The courtroom buzzed with tension as the case of the year unfolded. A high-stakes legal battle that had gripped the town for weeks. Every seat was taken, with reporters scribbling notes and spectators leaning forward, eager to catch every word. Judge Martha Campbell, a seasoned magistrate known for her no-nonsense demeanor, sat at the bench, her gavel ready to maintain order. The defendant, a prominent businessman accused of embezzlement, sat stone-faced, flanked by his legal team. Across from him, the prosecution prepared to present its final argument. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors creaked open. At first, no one noticed, but a soft padding of paws across the tiled floor soon caught the room's attention. Gasps rippled through the audience as a stray dog, matted and thin, trotted into the courtroom. The dog's coat was dusty, and its ribs were faintly visible, yet there was an unmistakable confidence in its steps. It stopped in the middle of the room and looked around as if scanning the faces. The room fell silent. Even Judge Campbell, known for her stern authority, paused mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Just as the bailiff stepped forward to usher the dog out, it let out a single sharp bark. Heads turned. The bailiff hesitated. The dog barked again, louder this time, its gaze fixed on the defendant. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Whispers began to circulate. What was the dog doing here, and why was it barking? Before anyone could act, the dog barked a 3rd time, each sound echoing like a command. Then it sat, its tail wagging faintly, as if signaling its work was done. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between the dog and the judge. Judge Campbell raised her gavel to regain control of the room, but before she could speak, the bailiff gasped and pointed at the dog's collar. A tiny key dangled from it, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. The courtroom froze. What was this key? And why did the dog seem so intent on being here, in this moment? The atmosphere crackled with suspense as everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Martha Campbell's eyes remained fixed on the stray dog, sitting confidently in the middle of the courtroom. The key dangling from its collar caught the light, reflecting onto the faces of the curious crowd. For the first time in her long career, Judge Campbell was at a loss for words. She leaned slightly forward, her usually steady hands gripping the edge of her desk. "Bailiff, secure the dog," she finally commanded, her voice breaking the stunned silence. The bailiff hesitated for a moment, then approached the dog cautiously. The stray didn't move. Its gaze remained locked on the defendant, David Hollis, the wealthy businessman accused of embezzling millions from local charities. Hollis squirmed in his chair, his polished exterior showing cracks as the dog's presence unsettled him. "What's going on here?" the defense attorney barked, rising from his seat. "This is highly irregular. Remove the animal immediately." The prosecution remained silent, watching the scene unfold with interest. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan, known for her sharp instincts, narrowed her eyes at the defendant. She noticed his unease and whispered to her assistant, "He's nervous. Why?" Meanwhile, the bailiff reached the stray, kneeling to inspect its collar. The dog allowed it, sitting still as if it understood the gravity of the situation. The bailiff unhooked the small, rusted key and held it up for the judge to see. "Your Honor, this key was attached to the dog's collar," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "A key?" Judge Campbell asked, her brow furrowing. "What does it unlock?" Before anyone could answer, the dog stood up and began walking towards the defense table, its movements deliberate and purposeful. Gasps rippled through the crowd as it stopped directly in front of Hollis, sitting again and letting out a soft growl. Hollis recoiled, his face pale, his hands gripping the table tightly. "Is this some kind of stunt?" Hollis's lawyer demanded, his voice rising in anger. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous disruption." Judge Campbell raised a hand to silence him. "Enough," she said, her tone cutting through the tension. "Bailiff, secure the dog and take it to the side for now. Let's get back to—" "Wait," Prosecutor Morgan interrupted, rising from her seat. "Your Honor, may I inspect that key?" This may be relevant to the case. Judge Campbell hesitated, but nodded. The bailiff handed the key to Morgan, who examined it closely. Her sharp eyes widened slightly as she turned it over in her hands. The rusty metal bore a faint marking, an emblem she recognized from the evidence file. "This emblem," Morgan said, holding up the key for the courtroom to see, "matches the logo of a private storage facility in town, a facility that's tied to Mr. Hollis." The room erupted in murmurs. Hollis's lawyer protested loudly, but Judge Campbell banged her gavel to restore order. "Quiet! Prosecutor Morgan, continue." Morgan stepped forward, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, we've been investigating Mr. Hollis for months. We believe he used a storage unit under a fake name to hide critical evidence, documents that would prove his embezzlement. This key might lead us to that evidence." The crowd buzzed with excitement and shock, but Judge Campbell remained composed. "Do you have enough to request a search warrant for this storage facility?" "Yes, Your Honor," Morgan replied, holding up a prepared motion. "Given this new development, I believe we have probable cause to search the facility immediately." Hollis's lawyer slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. You can't base a warrant on the actions of a stray dog. This entire proceeding is turning into a circus." Judge Campbell fixed him with a steely glare. "Mr. Carter, if your client has nothing to hide, then he has nothing to worry about. Prosecutor Morgan, your motion is granted. Bailiff, escort the prosecutor to ensure the warrant is executed without delay." The bailiff nodded and quickly exited the courtroom with Morgan, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The dog, still sitting near Hollis, watched them leave, its tail wagging faintly as if satisfied with the turn of events. Hollis's face had gone from pale to ashen, and he whispered furiously to his lawyer, who struggled to maintain his composure. Back in the courtroom, Judge Campbell addressed the audience. "We will adjourn until further notice. Bailiff, ensure the dog is taken care of and kept safe. This situation is unprecedented, but we must follow where the evidence leads." As the room began to clear, whispers filled the air. Who was this dog? How had it known to bring the key? And what would they find in the storage unit? Judge Campbell remained at her bench, watching as the dog was gently led out of the room. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of intrigue she hadn't experienced since her early days on the bench. This was no ordinary case, and the dog was no ordinary witness. The courtroom emptied, but the mystery deepened. What secrets did the storage unit hold, and why had this stray dog become the catalyst for exposing them? The next chapter of this extraordinary case was about to unfold. Outside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. As Prosecutor Elaine Morgan and the bailiff sped toward the storage facility, the rusty key clutched in her hand felt heavier with every passing moment, as if it carried the weight of the truth they were about to uncover. The stray dog's inexplicable actions played on her mind. What were the odds that this animal, of all creatures, would bring them the break they desperately needed? Back in the courtroom, Judge Campbell lingered in her chambers, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. Her mind wandered to the defendant, David Hollis, whose sudden discomfort at the dog's appearance hadn't gone unnoticed. There was something unsettling about his reaction, something more than mere annoyance at the disruption. Meanwhile, Hollis sat with his lawyer in a private meeting room, his calm facade crumbling under the pressure. "This can't be happening," he muttered, pacing the floor. "How did they even know about the storage unit?" His lawyer, Carter, tried to reassure him. "We don't know what they'll find. For all we know, that key could be meaningless." But Hollis wasn't convinced. He stopped pacing and stared out the window, his jaw clenched. "If they find those documents, it's over." At the storage facility, Morgan and the bailiff arrived with the warrant in hand. The facility manager, a wiry man in his 60s, looked confused as they explained their purpose. "You're saying this key came from a dog?" he asked incredulously. Morgan nodded, her tone firm. "Yes, and we believe it opens one of the units here. Please, we need your cooperation." The manager shrugged and led them to the unit matching the serial number etched on the key. The air was thick with anticipation as Morgan inserted the key into the lock. It clicked open with surprising ease, revealing a dark interior. The bailiff flicked on a flashlight, and the beam illuminated rows of file boxes stacked neatly inside. Morgan stepped forward, her heart pounding. She opened the nearest box and her breath caught in her throat. Inside were documents, ledgers, contracts, and receipts, all meticulously organized. Each piece of paper seemed to tell a damning story of embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud. "This is it," Morgan whispered. "We've got him." As word of the discovery reached the courtroom, chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled to update their stories, and whispers filled the air as the news spread. Hollis's lawyer demanded a recess, but the judge denied the request. "We will proceed as planned," Judge Campbell announced, her voice resolute. "If the evidence is admissible, it will be presented." Hollis, visibly sweating, leaned over to Carter. "You need to stop this," he hissed. "There's got to be a way to discredit that evidence." But Carter shook his head, his confidence waning. "The key came directly from the dog, Hollis. This isn't something we can argue away." Meanwhile, the stray dog, temporarily placed in the care of a local animal shelter, rested peacefully. The shelter staff couldn't help but marvel at the animal's calm demeanor. "It's like he knows he's done something important," one of the workers remarked, scratching behind the dog's ears. They decided to name him Justice, a fitting tribute to his unexpected heroism. As Morgan returned to the courtroom with boxes of evidence in tow, she was met with a standing room-only crowd. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as she presented the first batch of documents. "Your Honor," she began, addressing Judge Campbell, "these records confirm that Mr. Hollis has been siphoning funds from multiple charities into offshore accounts. The transactions are detailed and traceable. This key," she held it up for emphasis, "was the missing link." The defense scrambled to object, but Judge Campbell waved them off. "Let her finish." Morgan continued, her voice steady and deliberate. "We believe these funds were meant for underprivileged children, medical research, and community housing projects. Instead, they were funneled into accounts owned by Mr. Hollis under various aliases." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Hollis's pale face turned red, then white again, as the reality of the situation hit him. The once confident businessman now looked like a cornered animal. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Judge Campbell addressed the courtroom. "Based on the evidence presented today, this court has sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Mr. Hollis, you are remanded into custody until further notice." The gavel struck, and the room erupted. Reporters rushed to file their stories, spectators whispered in disbelief, and the prosecution exchanged quiet nods of satisfaction. But for all the commotion, one question lingered in everyone's mind. How had the dog known to intervene? Outside the courtroom, Morgan paused to take a breath. She looked up at the gray sky, the weight of the day finally settling on her shoulders. As she walked to her car, she couldn't stop thinking about Justice, the dog that had turned the case on its head. Sometimes, she murmured to herself, the universe works in mysterious ways." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the case progressed, but the story was far from over. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan, now equipped with damning evidence, knew she had the upper hand. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery of the stray dog was still unresolved. How had the animal acquired the key, and why had it appeared at such a critical moment? These questions lingered in her mind as the trial was adjourned for the day. Later that evening, as Morgan returned to her office, a call came in from the local animal shelter. The staff member on the line sounded excited. "Miss Morgan, we think you should see something. It's about the dog. Justice. There's something you need to know." Intrigued, Morgan headed to the shelter. When she arrived, Justice greeted her with a wagging tail, his eyes warm and intelligent. The shelter worker, a young woman named Carla, handed Morgan a faded dog tag. And we didn't notice it earlier, but Justice had this tucked under his collar, hidden beneath the key. It looks like a name tag. Morgan examined the tag closely. The engraving was worn, but she could still make out the name Max and an address on the outskirts of town. Her curiosity piqued. She decided to visit the address the next morning. The following day, Morgan arrived at the address listed on the tag, a small, run-down farmhouse surrounded by overgrown grass. She knocked on the door, and an elderly man answered, his face lighting up when he saw the tag in her hand. "Max," the man exclaimed, tears welling up in his eyes. "You found my Max?" Morgan explained the situation, telling the man about the dog's heroic actions in the courtroom. The man introduced himself as Henry, a retired locksmith who had lived alone for years. He recounted how Max, his loyal German shepherd, had gone missing months ago during a storm. "I thought I'd lost him forever," Henry said, his voice trembling. "He's more than just a dog to me, he's my family." Morgan asked Henry if he recognized the key that had been attached to Max's collar. Henry squinted at it, his expression shifting from joy to confusion. "That's one of my old keys," he said slowly. "I used to make spare keys for people around town, but this one belongs to David Hollis." Morgan froze. David Hollis, the defendant in our case. Henry nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yes, years ago, Hollis hired me to make keys for a private storage unit he owned. He said it was for business, but he paid me extra to keep quiet about it. I didn't think much of it at the time, but is this related to the trial?" Morgan's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. Max must have stumbled upon the storage unit while wandering the town, finding the key and bringing it to the courtroom by some incredible stroke of fate or instinct. The connection between Henry, Hollis, and the key was too significant to ignore. "Henry," Morgan said, her tone serious, "you might have just uncovered the missing link in our case. I need you to come with me to the courthouse and provide a statement." Back in the courtroom, the trial resumed with heightened anticipation. Hollis, now visibly anxious, glanced nervously at his lawyer as Morgan prepared to present her latest findings. She introduced Henry to the court, explaining his connection to both the key and the defendant. "Your Honor," Morgan began, addressing Judge Campbell, "this is Henry Dawson, a retired locksmith who worked for Mr. Hollis several years ago. He has confirmed that the key brought to us by the stray dog, Justice, was made for a private storage unit owned by the defendant." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hollis's lawyer immediately objected, claiming hearsay, but Judge Campbell overruled him. "Let the witness speak," she said firmly. Henry took the stand, recounting his story with surprising clarity for his age. He detailed how Hollis had hired him under suspicious circumstances, paying him extra to remain silent. "I didn't know what he was hiding in that unit," Henry concluded, "but I knew it wasn't above board." Morgan then presented additional evidence from the storage unit, documents that directly tied Hollis to the embezzlement scheme. These records, combined with Mr. Dawson's testimony, establish a clear link between the defendant and the illegal activities we've uncovered, she said. Hollis's lawyer attempted to poke holes in the testimony, but the damage was done. The jury members exchanged knowing glances, their skepticism toward Hollis growing by the minute. As the court adjourned for the day, Morgan couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. The case was unraveling in her favor, and Justice, the stray dog, had proven to be an unlikely hero. Yet the mystery of how Max had ended up with the key still gnawed at her. Was it pure coincidence, or was there more to the story? That evening, Morgan visited the animal shelter once more. As she sat with Justice and scratching behind his ears, she reflected on the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this point. "You're more than just a dog, aren't you?" she murmured. Justice wagged his tail, his intelligent eyes meeting hers as if to say, "You'll see." The courtroom was abuzz the following morning as the trial resumed. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The revelation about the key and its connection to the defendant had shifted the case dramatically, leaving David Hollis and his legal team visibly shaken. Judge Martha Campbell entered the room, her usual calm demeanor masking the curiosity swirling in her mind about how a stray dog had upended an intricate case. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan sat at her desk, reviewing her notes while occasionally glancing toward the back of the courtroom, where Henry Dawson had taken a seat. The retired locksmith had become an unexpected linchpin in the case, his testimony adding credibility to the prosecution's narrative. Beside him, Max, now affectionately nicknamed Justice, sat quietly, his presence earning him admiring smiles from everyone who noticed him. The defense team, however, was anything but composed. Hollis's lawyer, Carter, paced back and forth, clearly struggling to salvage his client's crumbling defense. Hollis himself sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks in his confident exterior were becoming impossible to ignore. As the proceedings began, Judge Campbell addressed the court. "We've reached a pivotal point in this trial. The evidence presented yesterday has raised significant questions about the defendant's actions and intent. Prosecutor Morgan, please proceed with your next witness. Morgan stood and approached the bench with calm confidence. Your Honor, I'd like to call Officer Rachel Torres to the stand. Officer Torres has been investigating reports of suspicious activity linked to the defendant's storage unit. Torres took the stand, her uniform crisp and her expression serious. She detailed the results of her investigation, describing how the storage unit had been under surveillance for months due to complaints of unusual deliveries and nighttime activity. We suspected the unit was being used for illicit purposes, she explained. However, we lacked the evidence to obtain a warrant until now. Morgan nodded. And during your surveillance, did you observe anything or anyone that could connect this unit directly to Mr. Hollis? Yes, Torres replied. We documented multiple visits by Mr. Hollis's vehicle. He often arrived late at night and stayed for extended periods. Our logs show that he made these visits regularly over the past year. The courtroom murmured as Morgan displayed time-stamped photographs of Hollis's car parked outside the storage facility. Your Honor, these images further corroborate Mr. Dawson's testimony and the documents retrieved from the storage unit. Judge Campbell leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Mr. Carter, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Carter stood, his expression tight. Yes, Your Honor. He approached Torres, attempting to cast doubt on her testimony. Officer Torres, are you absolutely certain that these visits were made by my client and not someone else using his vehicle? Torres didn't flinch. Yes, sir. In addition to visual confirmation, we also matched the vehicle's license plate to Mr. Hollis. There's no doubt it was him. Carter pressed on, but his efforts to discredit the evidence fell flat. The jury's expressions made it clear that they weren't buying his arguments. Hollis, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. As the day wore on, Morgan decided to revisit the role of justice in the case. During a recess, she approached Judge Campbell with an unusual request. Your Honor, I'd like to formally introduce Justice as a key figure in this trial. His actions directly led to the discovery of the evidence against Mr. Hollis, and I believe his presence could provide valuable insight into the timeline of events. Judge Campbell raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we call the dog to the stand, Ms. Morgan? Morgan chuckled softly. Not quite, Your Honor, but I do believe the jury deserves to understand the full context of how this evidence came to light. Justice's role in this case is unprecedented, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. After a moment's consideration, Judge Campbell nodded. Very well. You may proceed. When the trial resumed, Morgan addressed the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to discuss how this key and the evidence it led us to came into our possession. It was brought to us by this remarkable dog, Justice. She gestured toward the back of the room, where Justice sat proudly beside Henry. The dog's ears perked up as the attention of the entire courtroom turned to him. Justice's actions might seem extraordinary, even unbelievable, Morgan continued, but they highlight an important truth. Sometimes, the most unlikely heroes can bring justice to light. His instincts, his determination, these are qualities we often associate with loyalty and integrity, and in this case, they've proven invaluable. The jury members nodded, their expressions softening as they looked at the dog. Even Judge Campbell couldn't hide a faint smile. Meanwhile, Hollis's composure was rapidly deteriorating. He leaned toward Carter, his voice low but frantic. We need to do something. This can't go on. Carter shook his head. There's nothing we can do. The evidence is airtight, and the jury is already against us. Hollis clenched his fists, his face reddening with anger. This isn't over, he hissed. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the jury was visibly moved by the narrative of Justice's role in the case. Morgan felt a renewed sense of determination. The case was no longer just about exposing Hollis's crimes. It was about proving that truth and integrity, no matter how unlikely the source, could prevail. As the trial progressed, the courtroom buzzed with speculation and curiosity about the stray dog's remarkable role in the case. While the public and jury grew more fascinated by Justice E, Hollis's defense team was working frantically behind the scenes, trying to devise a strategy to discredit the evidence and regain control of the narrative. That evening, Elaine Morgan returned to her office, exhausted but focused. As she reviewed the case files, her phone buzzed. It was an email from a journalist who had been covering the trial. The subject line read, "Anonymous tip regarding Justice and Hollis connection." Intrigued, Morgan opened the email. The message was brief but shocking. Justice was no stray. He was trained by Hollis years ago for private security on his estate. Investigate further. You'll find more than you expect. The sender remained anonymous, but the claim left Morgan reeling. Could it be true? Could Justice have once belonged to the very man he helped expose? The possibility raised a troubling question. If Justice had a prior connection to Hollis, was his behavior truly instinctual, or was there a deeper story yet to be uncovered? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Morgan decided to visit Henry Dawson again. If anyone knew the truth about Justice's past, it would be the retired locksmith who had cared for him before the trial began. The next morning, Morgan arrived at Henry's farmhouse, where Justice greeted her with his usual enthusiasm. Henry invited her inside, offering her a cup of tea as she explained her concerns. "Henry, I received some information that Justice might have been connected to David Hollis before this case. Do you know anything about that?" Henry frowned, his face clouded with thought. "It's possible," he admitted. "When I found Max, Justice, he was wandering near the edge of town. He looked well-fed, like he'd been cared for recently, but there was no collar, no ID other than the tag with my address. I always thought it was odd that a dog like him would be abandoned." Morgan's mind raced. "And you didn't recognize the key on his collar?" Henry shook his head. "I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was from a random job I'd done years ago. But now that I think about it, I did some work for Hollis in the past, and he did have a security team with trained dogs. The pieces were beginning to fit together. If Justice had indeed been one of Hollis's trained security dogs, then his presence in the courtroom wasn't just a coincidence, it was fate." Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Hollis was growing increasingly desperate. During a recess, he cornered his lawyer, Carter's, in the hallway. "We need to take control of this story," he snapped. "If they dig too deep into Justice's past, they'll find out things I can't afford to have exposed." Carter, visibly frustrated, threw up his hands. "There's no way to stop this train, David. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the jury is already swayed by the dog's actions. Unless you have a miracle up your sleeve, there's nothing I can do." Hollis's eyes darkened, a dangerous glint flashing across his face. "If they're going to dig into Justice, maybe we should give them something else to focus on." The following day, a shocking development disrupted the trial. A video surfaced online, allegedly showing Justice in a previous altercation with a man at a construction site. The footage, grainy but clear enough to identify the dog, appeared to depict Justice lunging aggressively at the man, who was later revealed to be one of Hollis's former employees. The defense wasted no time seizing the opportunity. Carter presented the video in court, claiming it as evidence that Justice was an unpredictable animal with a history of aggression. "Your Honor," Carter argued, "this video raises serious questions about the credibility of this dog's behavior and whether he can be trusted as the so-called hero of this case." The jury exchanged uneasy glances, and even Judge Campbell seemed momentarily taken aback. Morgan, however, remained composed. She asked for a brief recess to investigate the validity of the video. During the break, Morgan worked tirelessly with her team to verify the footage. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The video had been heavily edited to paint Justice in a negative light. The original footage, sourced from a security camera, revealed the full context. Justice had been defending a child who had wandered into the construction site, placing himself between the child and a piece of falling debris. Morgan wasted no time presenting her findings in court. "Your Honor, the defense has presented a misleading video in an attempt to tarnish Justice's reputation," she declared. "The original footage clearly shows that Justice's actions were protective, not aggressive." She played the unedited video for the courtroom, and the mood shifted immediately. Gasps filled the room as the jury saw Justice risking his own safety to save the child. The tide had turned once again, and Hollis's attempt to undermine the dog's role had backfired spectacularly. As the day drew to a close, Morgan reflected on the challenges that had arisen and the resilience of the truth. Justice had proven time and time again that his instincts were pure and his actions driven by a sense of loyalty and protection. For Morgan, the case had become more than just a fight for justice. It was a testament to the bond between humans and animals and the extraordinary ways in which that bond could change lives. The following day, the courtroom was alive with tension. Hollis's attempt to discredit justice had backfired, but the ripple effects lingered. The jury appeared to be grappling with the emotional weight of the case, now layered with the dog's extraordinary story and the defendant's mounting desperation. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan took her place at the bench, her confidence tempered by the growing complexity of the trial. She knew she needed to maintain focus and keep the jury's trust, especially as Hollis's defense team became increasingly unpredictable. As the trial resumed, Morgan called Henry Dawson to the stand. The retired locksmith shuffled forward, adjusting his glasses nervously as he prepared to testify about how justice had come into his life, and ultimately, how he had led them to the evidence. The courtroom quieted as Morgan began her questioning. "Mr. Dawson," Morgan said, her voice calm and steady, "can you describe how you first encountered justice?" Henry cleared his throat. "Well, it was a stormy night, and I heard scratching at my back door. When I opened it, there he was, wet, shivering, and looking like he'd been wandering for miles. I couldn't turn him away." Morgan nodded. "And did you notice anything unusual about him?" Henry adjusted his glasses again. "Yes, he had a collar with a key attached to it. At first I didn't think much of it, figured it might belong to his previous owner. But then I recognized the shape of the key. It was one of mine." The jury leaned in, captivated. Morgan pressed on. "And when you examined the key, what did you discover?" "I realized it was a custom design I'd made years ago for a secure storage unit. I never expected it to resurface like this, especially on a dog's collar." Morgan turned to the jury. "So this key, which ultimately led us to evidence tied directly to the defendant, was brought to you by Justice, a stray dog who appeared on your doorstep. Is that correct?" Henry nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As Morgan stepped back, Carter rose to cross-examine Henry. His tone was sharp, his questions designed to sow doubt. "Mr. Dawson, isn't it possible that this dog could have come from anywhere? That the key might not even be connected to my client?" Henry frowned, his hands tightening around the edges of the witness stand. "I suppose it's possible, but..." Carter interrupted, his voice rising. "You're not certain, are you? You can't definitively prove that this dog has any connection to my client." Morgan objected, and Judge Campbell upheld it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The jury exchanged uncertain glances, and Morgan felt the delicate balance of the case shift once more. During the lunch recess, Morgan sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria, her thoughts racing. She knew the defense was exploiting the emotional weight of the trial, trying to manipulate the jury's perception of Justice's role. She needed a strategy to refocus the narrative and remind the jury of the undeniable facts. As she sipped her coffee, Henry approached her table, Justice trotting loyally at his side. "Ms. Morgan," Henry said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what Carter said. Maybe he's right. Maybe there's no way to prove where Justice came from." Morgan shook her head. "Don't let him get to you, Henry. The evidence speaks for itself. Justice led us to the key, and the key led us to the truth. That's what matters." Henry sighed, reaching down to scratch Justice behind the ears. "He's a good dog, Ms. Morgan. I just hope the jury sees that." Back in the courtroom, the tension continued to build. Morgan decided it was time to address the emotional undercurrents head-on. She called Dr. Sarah Bennett, an animal behaviorist, to the stand. Dr. Bennett's testimony aimed to highlight Justice's unique instincts and behaviors, offering a scientific perspective on his actions. "Dr. Bennett," Morgan began, "can you explain what might drive a dog like Justice to act in the way he did?" Dr. Bennett smiled warmly. "Dogs are incredibly perceptive creatures. They form strong bonds with humans and are often driven by loyalty and a desire to protect. In Justice's case, his actions suggest a remarkable level of intelligence and intuition." Morgan nodded. "Would you say that Justice's behavior aligns with that of a dog who might have been trained in the past?" "It's highly likely," Dr. Bennett replied. "His ability to retrieve the key and bring it to Mr. Dawson suggests a history of training, possibly in security or protection. Morgan turned to the jury. So, even if Justice's past remains a mystery, his instincts and actions in this case were extraordinary. Would you agree, Dr. Bennett? Absolutely, she said. Justice's behavior demonstrates not only intelligence, but also an unshakable sense of loyalty. The jury seemed moved by Dr. Bennett's testimony, but the defense wasn't finished. Carter stood, his expression grim. Doctor Bennett, isn't it true that dogs, no matter how well trained, can act unpredictably? Dr. Bennett tilted her head thoughtfully. That's true to an extent, but in my experience, a dog's actions are often reflective of their environment and upbringing. Justice's behavior in this case suggests a history of care and training, not unpredictability. Carter pressed further, but Dr. Bennett's calm, authoritative demeanor held firm. The jury's faith in justice was beginning to solidify once more. By the end of the day, Morgan felt a renewed sense of hope. Despite the defense's attempts to undermine the case, the truth was holding strong. Justice's presence in the courtroom continued to serve as a powerful reminder of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, a bond that could defy logic and bring light to the darkest of situations. The courtroom seemed to pulse with tension as the trial progressed. Each new development pulled the jury deeper into the complex web of events, and Prosecutor Morgan knew that she needed to keep the momentum in her favor. However, an unexpected twist was about to escalate the stakes even further. The morning session began with a surprising announcement from Hollis's defense team. Carter approached the bench with a folder in hand, his expression grim but determined. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Campbell, "the defense has obtained new evidence that we believe is critical to this case. It directly pertains to the prosecution's reliance on the dog, Justice." Morgan stiffened, her gaze fixed on Carter. "What is this evidence?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with suspicion. Carter opened the folder and handed a document to the judge. "We've obtained records suggesting that Justice, real name Max, was once part of a specialized K-9 training program for private security. These records indicate that he was trained specifically to retrieve objects, and that his presence at the crime scene may not have been as coincidental as the prosecution claims." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jury exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by this new revelation. Morgan, however, refused to be rattled. She quickly requested a recess to review the documents and prepare a rebuttal. During the recess, Morgan pored over the documents with her team. The records appeared legitimate, detailing Justice's enrollment in a private K-9 training facility and his subsequent deployment to a security firm owned by none other than David Hollis. The revelation was shocking but not entirely unexpected. Morgan turned to her assistant, a young paralegal named Ava, who had been instrumental in gathering evidence for the case. "We need to verify the authenticity of these records and find out why Hollis's team waited until now to bring this forward." Ava nodded, her fingers already flying over her laptop keyboard. "On it. If these records are real, there has to be more to the story." Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the jury's perception of justice was beginning to shift. The defense's revelation planted seeds of doubt, suggesting that the dog's actions might have been orchestrated or influenced by prior training. Carter seized the opportunity to cast further doubt, calling a former trainer from the K-9 facility to testify. The trainer, a gruff man named Martin Hayes, took the stand with a confident demeanor. "Yes, I remember Max," he said when asked about Justice. "He was one of the best dogs we ever trained, sharp, obedient, and incredibly loyal." Carter leaned forward, his tone measured. "Mr. Hayes, could you describe the kind of training Max received?" "Of course," Hayes replied. "He was trained in retrieval, tracking, and object recognition. If you gave him a command, he'd follow it without hesitation." Carter smiled faintly, turning to the jury. "So, it's fair to say that Max's ability to find and retrieve the key was a result of his training, not some miraculous instinct." Hayes hesitated, glancing at Justice, who was lying quietly at Henry Dawson's feet. "I suppose you could say that," he admitted, though his voice lacked conviction. When Morgan took her turn to cross-examine Hayes, she focused on the gaps in his testimony. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "you mentioned that Justice, Max, was trained at your facility. Can you confirm whether he was still under your care or Hollis's employ at the time of the events in question? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. No, he wasn't. He'd been missing for years. We assumed he was either stolen or abandoned. Morgan seized the opportunity. So you can't definitively say that his actions during this case were influenced by his training under your program? Hayes hesitated. No, I can't. Morgan nodded, turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a dog who, despite being abandoned and left to fend for himself, demonstrated remarkable intelligence and loyalty. His training may have been a part of his past, but his actions in this case were his own, a testament to the bond between humans and animals and the extraordinary nature of this particular dog. Outside the courtroom, Ava returned with new information that turned the tide once again. She had uncovered a series of emails between Hollis and the K9 training facility, revealing that Hollis had deliberately abandoned Justice after a failed security job, deeming him useless. The emails painted a damning picture of Hollis's disregard for the animals in his care. Morgan wasted no time presenting the emails as evidence. Your Honor, she said, addressing Judge Campbell, these emails show that the defendant not only abandoned Justice, but also demonstrated a pattern of cruelty and negligence toward the animals under his employ. Justice's role in this case is not a coincidence. It's poetic justice. The jury's expression shifted once more, their initial doubts giving way to renewed conviction. Hollis's actions were not only criminal, but deeply unethical, and Justice's actions now carried even greater weight. As the day ended, Morgan reflected on the escalating tension and the intricate web of revelations that had unfolded. The defense's attempts to undermine Justice's role had backfired spectacularly, revealing even more about Hollis's character and solidifying the dog's role as a hero in the eyes of the jury. Justice, as if sensing the shift, rested his head on Henry's knee, his eyes calm and trusting. Morgan couldn't help but smile. The case was far from over, but she knew they were one step closer to the truth and to justice. The courtroom had become a stage for a drama no one had anticipated. Each day seemed to bring new revelations, and the case now transcended the mere facts of the crime. It was about loyalty, redemption, and the unexpected heroes that could emerge from the most unlikely places. The following morning, Morgan arrived at the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. The emails Ava had uncovered had shaken the defense's confidence, and the jury appeared to be leaning toward the prosecution's narrative. However, Morgan knew she couldn't rely solely on the emotional pull of Justice's story. She needed to solidify their case with indisputable evidence. Before the trial resumed, Morgan met with Henry Dawson and Justice in a quiet corner of the courthouse. Justice wagged his tail as Henry scratched behind his ears. "He's something special," Henry said, his voice filled with emotion. "I've never seen a dog like him." Morgan nodded. "He's the heart of this case, Henry. But we need more than that to ensure Hollis is held accountable. We have to connect every dot in every piece of evidence." Henry looked thoughtful. "What if Justice can help us again? He's led us this far." Morgan smiled faintly. "We'll see. For now, let's focus on what we know." Back in the courtroom, Morgan called Detective Elena Ruiz to the stand. Detective Ruiz had been instrumental in recovering the physical evidence from Hollis's property, including the stolen items linked to the crime. Her testimony was meant to tie everything together, creating a clear timeline that left no room for doubt. "Detective Ruiz," Morgan began, "can you describe the scene when you searched the defendant's property?" Ruiz leaned forward, her tone professional and deliberate. "We found several items that matched descriptions from the victim's family: antique watches, jewelry, and other valuables. They were hidden in a locked storage unit behind the main house." Morgan gestured toward the evidence table. "And how did you gain access to this storage unit?" Ruiz glanced at Justice, who was lying quietly at Henry's feet. "The key was provided to us by Mr. Dawson, who received it from Justice. Without it, we wouldn't have been able to search the unit." Morgan turned to the jury. "So, Justice's actions directly led to the discovery of evidence critical to this case?" Ruiz nodded. "That's correct." As Morgan stepped back, Carter rose for his cross-examination. He aimed to downplay the significance of Ruiz's testimony, suggesting that the evidence could have been planted or obtained under questionable circumstances. However, Ruiz's calm and detailed responses left little room for doubt. Frustrated, Carter turned his attention back to justice. "Detective Ruiz, would you say that relying on a dog to provide evidence is unconventional?" Ruiz didn't miss a beat. "Perhaps, but unconventional doesn't mean unreliable. Justice's actions were consistent with his training and instincts. He's proven himself to be a vital part of this investigation." Carter pressed on, but the jury's expression suggested they weren't buying his arguments. The bond between justice and the case was too strong to break. During the lunch recess, Morgan and Ava reviewed their strategy for the afternoon session. Ava had uncovered additional information about Hollis's activities, including records of payments to the K9 training facility that suggested a deeper involvement in the illegal trade of trained animals. "This could be the smoking gun," Ava said, sliding the documents across the table. Morgan studied them carefully. "If we can prove that Hollis was using these dogs for illicit purposes and then discarding them, it not only strengthens our case, but also shows a pattern of behavior." When court resumed, Morgan presented the documents detailed transactions between Hollis and several organizations known for questionable practices, including the purchase of trained K9s. The jury listened intently as Morgan outlined how these deals connected to Justice's past and Hollis's criminal enterprise. Hollis didn't just commit theft, Morgan concluded. He exploited and discarded living creatures for his own gain, showing a complete lack of regard for both human and animal life. The jury's reaction was palpable. The weight of Hollis's actions was becoming increasingly clear, and the emotional undercurrent of the trial grew stronger. As the day drew to a close, Morgan decided to call Henry Dawson back to the stand. She wanted to remind the jury of the human element in the case, the way justice had brought people together and revealed the truth. "Mr. Dawson," Morgan began, "can you describe how justice has impacted your life since he appeared on your doorstep?" Henry smiled, his gaze shifting to the dog. "Justice saved me as much as I saved him. I was lonely, and my farm was struggling. Then he showed up, carrying that key and changing everything. He's not just a dog, he's a miracle." Morgan nodded. "And do you believe that Justice's actions in this case were intentional? That he understood what he was doing?" Henry's voice was steady. "I do. He's got a heart bigger than most people I've met. He knew what was right, and he acted on it." As Henry stepped down, the courtroom fell silent. Justice wagged his tail, as if sensing the growing support around him. Morgan felt a surge of hope. The connections between the characters, Henry, Justice, and even Hollis, had been laid bare, creating a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The air in the courtroom was charged with tension as the trial neared its most critical juncture. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every moment Justice had played a role was leading to this point. The prosecution and defense were locked in a battle, each determined to sway the jury. For Morgan, this was the moment she had been preparing for, a decisive push that would leave no doubt about Hollis's guilt. The day began with Carter attempting to regain control of the narrative. His strategy was to undermine the prosecution's emotional appeal by focusing on cold, hard facts, or rather, casting doubt on them. He called to the stand a private investigator hired by the defense to scrutinize Justice's role in the case. The investigator, a stern-looking man named Grayson Hill, took his seat with a composed demeanor. Carter wasted no time diving into his questions. "Mr. Hill, in your expert opinion, could the actions of this dog, Justice, be interpreted as coincidence rather than intent?" Hill nodded. "It's possible. Dogs often act on instinct, and what may appear as deliberate behavior could simply be chance." Carter smiled, as though this single statement had dismantled the prosecution's case. "So, you're saying it's unlikely this dog consciously retrieved a key related to the crime?" Hill shrugged. "Unlikely, yes. Without further evidence, we can't definitively say the dog knew what it was doing." Morgan rose for cross-examination, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She approached Hill with measured steps, her tone steady. "Mr. Hill, are you a certified animal behaviorist?" Hill blinked, momentarily thrown off. "No, I'm not," Morgan continued, her voice firm. So your opinion on Justice's behavior is based purely on speculation? Hill hesitated. I suppose you could say that. Morgan nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hill. No further questions. Her point was clear. The defense's attempt to discredit Justice was built on shaky ground. The jury took note, their focus shifting back to the undeniable facts of the case. The prosecution's next move was to present the timeline of events leading up to Justice's discovery of the key. Ava, who had meticulously pieced together surveillance footage, cell tower data, and witness accounts, took the stand to testify. Using a series of visuals displayed on the courtroom screens, Ava walked the jury through the sequence of events. This footage shows Justice approaching the shed where the key was hidden, she explained, pointing to a grainy video clip. And here you can see him returning to Mr. Dawson with the key in his mouth. Morgan leaned forward, addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this wasn't a random act. Justice's actions were deliberate and pointed, leading us directly to the evidence that unraveled the defendant's crimes. Carter objected, claiming the footage was circumstantial and didn't prove intent. Judge Campbell allowed the objection, but permitted Morgan to continue. The defense's counter-arguments were growing weaker, their attempts to discredit Justice and the evidence losing traction. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Hollis, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, began to show signs of agitation. His lawyer frequently whispered to him, attempting to keep him calm, but the cracks in his composure were becoming evident. The turning point came when Morgan called her final witness, a former employee of Hollis, who had come forward with critical information. A young woman named Clara Evans took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. Ms. Evans, Morgan began, her voice kind but firm. Can you tell the court about your experience working for Mr. Hollis? Clara hesitated, glancing nervously at Hollis before speaking. I worked for him for 3 years. At first, it seemed like a normal job, but over time I realized there were things happening that weren't right. Morgan nodded encouragingly. What kind of things? Clara took a deep breath. He was involved in illegal activities, smuggling rare items and animals. Justice was one of the dogs he used for these operations. When Justice failed a mission, he abandoned him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Campbell banged his gavel, calling for order. Morgan seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. Ms. Evans, are you saying that the defendant not only committed theft, but also exploited animals like Justice for his criminal activities? Yes, Clara said, her voice steady now. Justice was trained to retrieve items for him. But when he didn't perform to his expectations, he was left to fend for himself. Morgan turned to the jury, her expression fierce. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just a case about theft. It's about a man who exploited and discarded living creatures for his own gain. Justice didn't just find that key. He sought redemption for the mistreatment he endured. And in doing so, he exposed the truth about David Hollis. Hollis's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions revealed that Morgan's words had struck a chord. The emotional weight of the case was undeniable, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Morgan turned to the jury, her expression fierce. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just a case about theft. It's about a man who exploited and discarded living creatures for his own gain. Justice didn't just find that key, he sought redemption for the mistreatment he endured. And in doing so, he exposed the truth about David Hollis. Hollis's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions revealed that Morgan's words had struck a chord. The emotional weight of the case was undeniable, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial reached its penultimate stage. Each side had laid their cards on the table, and the jury was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how the pieces would fall. For Morgan, this moment wasn't just about presenting evidence. It was about delivering a story so compelling that the jury couldn't look away, a story that demanded justice not just for Henry and his farm, but for Justice the dog himself. The next day began with David Hollis taking the stand. It was a calculated risk by the defense, but they were running out of options. Carter hoped Hollis could sway the jury by presenting himself as a misunderstood businessman who had been wrongfully accused. However, Morgan saw this as an opportunity to dismantle his narrative piece by piece. Hollis took his seat, his demeanor confident but guarded. Carter began with soft questions, painting Hollis as a hard-working man who had been unfairly targeted. "Mr. Hollis, can you tell us about your business and how you've contributed to the community?" Hollis nodded, his voice measured. "I've run a successful logistics company for over a decade. We've provided jobs, supported local charities, and helped countless businesses thrive." Carter smiled, turning to the jury as if to say, "See, he's just a regular guy." But Morgan was already preparing to strike. When it was her turn to cross-examine, Morgan's tone was calm but sharp. "Mr. Hollis, you've described yourself as a community leader, but let's talk about your other activities. Can you explain why multiple witnesses have testified that you were involved in illegal trafficking?" Hollis stiffened, his confidence faltering. "Those are baseless accusations." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Baseless? Clara Evans testified under oath about your involvement. Are you saying she lied?" Hollis hesitated. "I'm saying she's mistaken." Morgan leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room. "Mistaken about the forged documents, the stolen goods, or the trained dogs you abandoned when they no longer served your purpose?" The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Hollis. He shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Morgan pressed on. "Let's talk about justice. Witnesses have confirmed that he was trained under your supervision. Can you deny that?" Hollis's jaw tightened. "I didn't personally train him." "But you knew about it," Morgan countered. "And when he didn't meet your expectations, you abandoned him. Isn't that true?" Hollis tried to deflect. "That's not relevant to this case." Morgan's voice rose slightly, her passion shining through. "It's entirely relevant. Justice's actions led to the discovery of the key, the stolen goods, and ultimately, your criminal activities. He's not just a dog in this case, Mr. Hollis. He's a victim and a hero." As Hollis stepped down, visibly shaken, Morgan turned to the jury for her final arguments. She began by recounting the journey of justice, from an abandoned dog to a courtroom hero. Her words painted a vivid picture of loyalty, resilience, and the search for truth. "Justice was thrown away like he didn't matter," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But he didn't give up. He found his way to Henry Dawson, and when the time came, he did what no one else could. He uncovered the truth." Morgan then shifted her focus to Hollis. "On the other hand, we have a man who exploited animals, broke the law, and tried to cover his tracks. He thought he could get away with it, but justice had other plans." Carter's closing arguments were subdued. He tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that justice's actions were coincidental. But his words lacked conviction, and the jury's attention seemed to drift. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom emptied, leaving Morgan, Henry, and Justice to wait in tense silence. Henry stroked Justice's fur, his eyes filled with gratitude and worry. "Do you think they'll see the truth?" he asked. Morgan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They have everything they need to make the right decision." Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once more as everyone awaited the verdict. The foreperson stood, holding the small slip of paper that would decide Hollis's fate. "In the matter of David Hollis, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Henry hugged Justice tightly, tears streaming down his face. Morgan closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of the moment wash over her. They had done it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Morgan addressed the crowd, her voice firm and resolute. This case was about more than just theft. It was about loyalty, courage, and the bond between humans and animals. Justice reminded us all of what's truly important, and I hope this serves as a reminder to protect and cherish every life. Henry spoke next, his words simple but heartfelt. "Justice saved my life in more ways than one. I'll never forget what he's done for me and this community." As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, Justice wagged his tail, seemingly unfazed by the attention. He had done what he was meant to do, and now he was ready to return home to a farm where he was loved and valued. The air in the courtroom buzzed with the energy of the verdict. While the declaration of Hollis's guilt was met with a surge of relief and quiet cheers, the emotional peak of the story had not yet arrived. For Henry, Morgan, and Justice, the moment was about more than legal triumph. It was about closure, justice, and redemption. As the court emptied, Judge Campbell called Morgan, Henry, and Justice forward to the bench. The judge removed his glasses and looked down at Justice Dow, who sat obediently by Henry's side, his tail wagging faintly. "I've presided over hundreds of cases," Judge Campbell said, his voice softer than it had been throughout the trial, "but I've never seen anything like this. Justice isn't just a dog, he's a symbol of loyalty and courage. Henry, you're lucky to have him, and I believe the community is lucky to have both of you." Henry's voice cracked as he responded, "Your Honor, I think I'm the lucky one. Justice saved my life, twice. I'll never be able to repay him for what he's done." The judge nodded solemnly. "Sometimes, Henry, the best way to repay loyalty is with love, and from what I've seen, Justice is already receiving plenty of that." Morgan, standing beside Henry, couldn't help but feel a surge of pride, not just in the case, but in the bond between Henry and Justice. "Your Honor," she interjected, "Justice didn't just save Henry. He brought the truth to light, something that might never have happened without him." Judge Campbell smiled faintly. "That he did. And it's a lesson for all of us to trust in the unexpected and recognize the extraordinary in what we often overlook." Outside the courthouse, the press eagerly awaited a glimpse of Justice, now a local hero. Cameras flashed as Morgan, Henry, and Justice stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The crowd cheered, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Justice" and "Hero Dog of the Year." One reporter shouted, "Henry, what's next for Justice?" Henry smiled, ruffling the fur on Justice's neck. "He's going back to the farm, where he belongs. He's earned a quiet life, but I think he'll always be ready for the next adventure." Another reporter turned to Morgan. "Do you think this case will set a precedent?" Morgan nodded firmly. "Absolutely. This case isn't just about one man's crimes or one dog's actions. It's a reminder of the incredible bonds between humans and animals and the importance of justice for all ones, no matter the species." As the media frenzy continued, a small group from the local animal shelter approached. They presented Henry with a plaque that read, "In honor of justice for loyalty, courage, and unwavering devotion." Henry held the plaque in his hands, his voice breaking as he addressed the crowd. "This is for justice, but it's also for every animal out there who's been abandoned or mistreated. Justice is a reminder that every life has value and every soul deserves a chance." The crowd erupted into applause as Justice barked, seemingly in response to the cheer. The sound brought laughter and tears to those gathered, cementing his status as not just a hero, but a beloved member of the community. That evening, Henry, Morgan, and Justice returned to the farm. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the fields. Henry stood by the fence, watching his animals graze, while Justice lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws. Morgan joined him, a contented smile on her face. "It feels like the storm has finally passed," she said softly. Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I never thought I'd see the day where everything felt right again. Justice brought me back to life, Morgan. I owe him everything." Morgan reached down to scratch behind Justice's ears. "I think he knows that. And I think he feels the same way about you." As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Henry knelt beside Justice, speaking to him as though he were an old friend. "You've done more than I could have ever asked, buddy. You've given me hope again. I promise you'll always have a home here." Justice licked Henry's hand in response, his tail wagging gently. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, a bond forged through adversity and sealed with love. In the following weeks, Justice became a local legend. Schools invited Henry to speak about his story, sharing lessons of resilience and compassion. Justice accompanied him, always sitting proudly by his side as children listened with wide-eyed wonder. Morgan, too, found herself inspired by the case. She started a community initiative aimed at supporting abandoned animals, using Justice's story as a rallying cry. The program, named Justice's Legacy, aimed to provide care, shelter, and second chances to animals in need. But for Henry and Justice, life eventually returned to a peaceful rhythm. Days were spent tending to the farm, with Justice happily following Henry wherever he went. Nights were quiet, filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustle of the wind through the trees. One evening, as Henry sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Justice curled up at his feet. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there is always light. Looking down at Justice, Henry smiled. "You're more than a dog, Justice. You're my family." And in the stillness of the evening, with the world at peace, it was clear that Justice felt the same. The tranquility of the farm was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in the courtroom and the town. For Henry and Justice, life had settled back into its natural rhythm. But the echoes of their story continued to ripple far beyond the quiet fields. Justice had become a symbol, a reminder that loyalty, courage, and determination could come from the most unexpected places. Across the country, news outlets continued to cover his story, sharing the incredible journey of a dog who had not only saved his owner, but uncovered a web of deceit and criminality. Henry found himself adjusting to his newfound recognition. The farm, once struggling to make ends meet, was now thriving thanks to the attention their story had brought. Visitors from all over wanted to meet Justice, the hero dog, and Henry welcomed them with open arms, sharing his story with anyone who cared to listen. But fame never changed Justice. To him, the world was simple: protect Henry, care for the animals, and bask in the affection of the people who came to see him. He remained the same loyal companion who had braved storms and danger to defend his owner. One afternoon, as Henry repaired the barn door, a car pulled up to the driveway. Morgan stepped out, her bright smile immediately lighting up the scene. In her arms, she held a small stack of papers. "Henry," she called, walking toward him. "I've got something for you." Henry wiped his hands on his overalls and met her halfway, his curiosity piqued. "What's this?" he asked, taking the papers. Morgan grinned. "It's official recognition from the mayor's office. Justice is being honored as the town's first honorary guardian. They want to dedicate a day to him every year. Justice Day." Henry laughed, shaking his head. "That dog's going to have more accolades than I'll ever see in my lifetime." Justice, lying in the shade nearby, perked up his ears at the sound of his name, wagging his tail lazily. Morgan knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "He deserves it, Henry, and so do you. What you both did went beyond just saving a farm. You reminded everyone what it means to fight for what's right." The inaugural Justice Day was held in the town square a few weeks later. Families gathered, children wore t-shirts with Justice's face printed on them, and the mayor gave a heartfelt speech about the bond between humans and animals. When it was his turn to speak, Henry addressed the crowd with quiet sincerity. "This dog saved my life, not just once, but in so many ways. Justice isn't just a hero to me, he's family. And I hope his story inspires all of you to see the value in every life, no matter how small or overlooked." The applause that followed was deafening, and as Justice barked, the crowd erupted into laughter and cheers. He was, as always, the star of the show. As time passed, the community initiative Morgan had started, Justice's Legacy, gained momentum. Donations poured in, and volunteers signed up to help animals in need. Justice himself became the face of the campaign, his story serving as a beacon of hope for animals and people alike. Morgan and Henry grew closer through their shared efforts. Though they never sought the limelight, their dedication to Justice's legacy turned them into local icons of compassion and resilience. One evening, as Henry sat on the porch watching the sunset, Morgan joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. Justice lay at their feet, his head resting on Henry's boots. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if Justice hadn't come into your life?" Morgan asked, her voice thoughtful. Henry nodded slowly. "All the time. I don't know where I'd be without him. He gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I'd lost everything." Morgan smiled, her gaze shifting to the horizon. "He's not just a dog, you know. He's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope." As the stars began to dot the sky, Henry reached down to pat Justice's side. "You hear that, boy? "You're not just a dog, you're a miracle." Justice wagged his tail, as if he understood every word. The years went by, and though the world continued to change, the bond between Henry and Justice remained unshakable. The farm flourished, Justice's legacy expanded to neighboring towns, and their story became a part of the community's history. For Henry, life was no longer about survival. It was about gratitude, love, and the simple joys of every day spent with his loyal companion. As the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon one quiet evening, Henry sat on the porch with Justice by his side. The farm was peaceful, the air filled with the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Looking down at his faithful friend, Henry whispered, "Thank you, Justice, for everything." Justice lifted his head, his eyes meeting Henry's, and in that silent exchange there was a lifetime's worth of understanding and love. This story of Henry and Justice reminds us all of the incredible bond between humans and animals and the life-changing impact they can have on one another. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. And remember, every act of kindness, no matter how small, can make a world of difference. See you in the next story.